think about, is really worth your life? Is what you're doing today, is your task really worth losing your life, 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 losing your life? Just must be a terrible way to die, to die, to die, to die, to die, to die, to die.
Bill, are you sure this is going to take care of our water problem?
George, you're not going to have anything to worry about. Once we get the pipe in the ground, it's going to take care of all that. Trust me, okay?
All right, get the pipe in the ground.
Great. Maurice needs my help. Let me
All
help
right.
him. Maurice, you ready?
Yes, sir.
Okay, let's get this thing in. Great. How's it fitting?
Just fine on this end. Maybe you should check the other end.
Okay. Here, let me come in and help you, okay?
Bill, watch out!
George! Call 911! Get him here now! Maurice, you all right? Where's
Don't
Bill?
worry about me. Bill's over there.
Where?
Over there, there.
Bill! 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 Maurice, I found his hand. Bill! 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 Thank God you guys are here. We've got a collapsed trench. We've got one guy buried up to the waist, the other one covered completely. You guys got to help.
Okay, we got a couple guys in the trench.
It's right over here. It's right over here. Bill!
Hey, guy, come on.
Bill!
Hey, you have to come out of the hole.
For my boss!
We'll take care of him. Come on out of the hole.
For my boss, you got to get Bill!
I need to ask you a few questions. Hold on a second.
We got Bill.
That's what I want to ask you about Bill. Was Bill unconscious when you were down there with him?
Yes, sir.
Was his head covered at any time? His head
Yes,
out?
sir. I'm covered.
Was he breathing? Could you tell if he was breathing or not?
I couldn't tell, sir.
No. I don't have pulse on the cat. Pulse is active.
I doubt that any of you go to work in the morning thinking that tragedy will strike your work site before the day is over. Like in this case. While one person survived, the foreman didn't. Let's face it, no one should ever die in a trench collapse, because trench collapses should never occur. This equipment and know-how exist to prevent that. Regulations state that any trench deeper than 5 feet, along with any other trench felt to be unsafe, must be protected. This means properly shored, shielded, sloping, or benching the sides of the trench. Yet, people still die in trench collapses. Sometimes someone's in too big a hurry to spend the time it takes to install the safety equipment or properly slope the trench. But time seems like a pretty poor reason after someone has been killed or maimed for life. It's hard to believe that people can be that short-sighted about their own safety or the safety of others. But it happens all the time. Too many people think an accident won't happen to them or their crew, or they're alert or quick enough to get out of the way as soon as something starts to go wrong, or the trench isn't that deep to worry about, or it's okay to take a risk for just a couple of minutes. But it's never okay to enter an unprotected trench greater than 5 feet deep or one that is otherwise unsafe for any reason.
hot spring day last April, a team of construction workers broke for lunch from a waterproofing job in a residential community in Howard County, Maryland. One of the workers left a tool in the trench and decided to go back and retrieve it. The trench had not been shored, and just as the worker entered the deepest part, it collapsed, burying him up to his chest and pinning him against the chimney of the house. When fellow contractors attempted a rescue, they caused secondary collapses. They then installed some makeshift shoring and called the fire department for help. The first units dispatched to the scene were rescue companies from Howard County Fire and Rescue. What they found on arrival was a trench running along the length of the residence, excavated down to the footers. The trench was thinner where a chimney and cellarway protruded, and the victim was pinned in the narrowest section with his leg twisted behind him.
The major concern with regard to the patient was that we had very little information as to what was going on below the level of, say, his waistline. I was concerned that he might have a pelvic injury or a blunt injury to his abdomen, in which case he would not only be losing fluid internally, essentially third spacing it, but in addition to that, he was in a vertical position, and thus there was very little we could do to deal with that other than to give him volume. The other issue was that, as you can see from the video, he's in a very tight, confined space with his face up against the dirt. And after a while, he began to become somewhat combative, or potentially combative, certainly a little bit disoriented.
These two people have been trained to deal with trench collapse emergencies. It may be a surprise that many communities have invested lots of money to train people in responding to trench collapse emergencies. They wouldn't do this if there wasn't a big enough need, but there is. If you have ever worked or continue to work in unprotected trenches, maybe this will help you understand the serious risk you've been taking.
Let's talk about rescue versus recovery. Most people involved in trench collapses that are covered by these types of soils or any kind of soils are faced with a variety of compression factors, asphyxiation factors, and traumatic injuries associated with the collapse. Most people who are completely buried as a result of trench collapses are going to be fatalities. And as far as I know, most dead people stay dead. And subsequently, there is no need for a firefighter or an EMS person to risk their lives digging like a dog in an open trench or excavation associated with a collapse. Now obviously, if the individual is uncovered, say from the waist or the chest up, that is very possibly going to be a rescue. And that's when you have to start making decisions. And the decisions that you make should be made with your head, not with your heart. Compassion is a killer in these types of operations. Yes, people are going to be screaming. Yes, they're going to be in pain. But if you let those overriding factors make decisions for you about whether you're going to get into a situation like this, you're going to end up as a statistic too.
Rescue versus recovery. Dead. Screaming, pain. These are scary words, especially when referring to you or one of your coworkers. Hopefully, you'll never see someone get buried in a trench collapse. But if you do, keep in mind that trained rescuers don't just jump in the hole and start digging. So you shouldn't either. It's estimated that 60 to 70% of all trench fatalities are would-be rescuers. These fatalities will generally result from secondary collapses. Now, why do trench collapses occur in the first place? Emergency responders have to understand this, just as you do, so they can have a full appreciation of the risk involved.
Whenever you take dirt out of a trench, you have a variety of hydrostatic forces. You can see the water coming out of this trench. When you open this area, gravity and water want to take this trench and these trench walls, and they want to push them into the center. So whenever we take dirt out of an opening like this, we end up with several things occurring. We end up with hydrostatic forces or water forces wanting to push this thing in. We also end up with mean old Mr. Gravity wanting to push that in. Now you'll hear terms called freestanding time. A construction industry representative may tell you that this trench has a freestanding time of 2 hours, meaning that from the time it's cut until the time it falls in will be 2 hours. I will tell you that that's bunk. Are you willing to take the chance that your freestanding time is 2 hours or 2 minutes? I don't think so. So never, ever enter an unprotected trench. Collapses generally occur in three different formats. The first one, a spoil pile slide, is where the spoil actually comes into the trench. A large volume of dirt moving into the trench can actually bury somebody. The second scenario is this slough in, where the belly bows outward, and this may or may not leave this overhang. Remember, we said that lip is a very dangerous place to be, and that's why. The third scenario that could happen is this could actually shear like an iceberg. When that occurs, the biggest injury problem and killer of patients is the sheer weight of this dirt. A cubic foot of dirt may weigh 100 pounds. What that means is 2 feet of dirt on a victim's back or chest actually weighs about 700 pounds. That, associated with the kinetic energy of the dirt actually moving, can entrap the patients. It can crush them, and even if their head's uncovered but their chest has 700 pounds on it, it can actually asphyxiate them. If a cubic foot weighs 100 pounds, a cubic yard weighs 1.5 tons. That type of energy is destructive.
It certainly is. Think of what that can do to the human body, your body.
When a person is trapped in a cave-in, all the weight of the soil is superimposed upon his limbs or extremities or his body. By doing that, the blood and the circulation is restricted to that area. And when that happens, it causes what they call crush syndrome. It squeezes him to death where he just can't inhale. You can't move your lungs, asphyxiation, suffocating. Kidneys fail, and you could have a heart attack, be hypothermic. Congestive heart failure where they just couldn't breathe and they drowned in their own fluid. I mean, it just must be a terrible way to die. It must be.
Going back to our case where the man was trapped next to the chimney, the rescuers were able to get him out safely. But here's another case that didn't have such a happy ending.
Okay, it was around 12:30 on a Saturday. I was just waking up from working a night shift when I got a panic knock at the door. The guys next door, they were putting in a sewer system. When I opened the door, "What do you mean?" He said, "It caved in on them." I dialed 911 and I expressed to them that I didn't know what was going on. All I knew was that somebody came over and told me a guy was buried underneath some dirt and to dispatch me some rescue. When I ran there, all I seen was a hole with dirt and a panic guy trying to dig him out with a backhoe. So at that time, I said, I gotta get this guy out of here. I jumped in the hole and I started digging with my hands, and I instructed the guy with the backhoe to dig to my left side so he could help me dig out some dirt as I'm pushing to get to him. The hole was about 11 feet deep and he was covered about 7 foot of it. I got maybe down 2 feet by myself, and a police officer showed up on the scene and started to help me. So this time we started getting oxygen bottles and hooking it up to a garden hose so we could feed some oxygen down to him. Then fire personnel started getting near the ambulance, and they started getting in the hole with us, and we just all started digging with our hands. Well, about 10 to 12 minutes after digging with the fire personnel, we started to recover his upper portion of his body. We could see his head and his shoulders. And at that time, you could see his face was blue. So that means he wasn't breathing, or if he was, he was having a hard time. He was lifeless. He was just limp. Well, once we got him out to where we had his full chest out and we could lay him back, we tried to open his airway. There was dirt impaled in his air. I mean, it was all in his airway. We tried to get air through and there was no way. And that's when a medic jumped down and tried to tube him. Then I started on compressions, which we don't know how much good it would have did, but we had to try. With that much dirt on you, it's hard to live, let alone breathe.
Our arrival time was probably 30 to 40 minutes into the incident. In the meantime, they worked on the victim. EMS was working on the victim, along with police officers trying to get him out. They attempted to do some shoring at that point, but they really didn't have any equipment or any experience with this type of incident to do that type of job. The police had put the family to the side. They were in the front yard of the residence where the incident occurred. They were in lawn chairs sitting there, kind of waiting for the, I don't think at that point they had word that the victim was deceased.
I seen the family members all around, And they know my face, but they really don't know my name. They know me as a neighbor. They kept asking me, is he alive? Is he okay? Is he alive? And I couldn't bring myself to say anything. And the only thing I could do was look at them and put my head down. And they kind of knew.
Once the manpower pool was established, we had the firefighters begin removing the spoil pile from the side of the trench. I knew at that point that the victim was deceased, and so we were going to take our time and just make it a safe removal from the trench. We also established an airbag in the trench to prevent further collapse, which that did. Approximately 3 hours into the operation, we had a secondary collapse come up the trench. The airbag held the trench together at that point. We got our first panels into the trench. Once that was done, we were able to step down the shoring and get right down to where the victim was. And the area was safe to operate. We put ventilation into the trench at that point. The trench was monitored for hazardous atmosphere. Once we were able to enter the trench safely, the rescuers proceeded in and began hand digging with hand tools to remove the victim. We continued doing that until we finally got down to his feet, where we were able to pull him free from the trench. I think they learned, everyone learned on that situation how complicated this scene can be and what has to be done to safety the trench prior to their entry.
Safety of the trench prior to entry. This is what trained emergency responders think of before they attempt to rescue someone from a collapsed trench. It's also what you should think of any time you enter a trench 5 feet or greater in depth, or one that is otherwise felt to be unsafe. If this trench had been made safe prior to entry, there would have been no need for an emergency response, because the trench would not have collapsed on anyone. But it wasn't made safe, and this man paid for that mistake with his life. That's too steep of a price, and it's one that you don't want to pay either.
Think about what you're doing, and think about your family, and think about, is it really worth your life? Is what you're doing today, is your task really worth losing your life and bringing all that heartache on your family? And I don't think it is. And I think you feel the same way. It's not. So I would ask you to become competent and aware of what you do, your trade, and take that and apply that in what you do. And don't put yourself at risk for needlessly.